The mist clung to Ashwood Valley like a shroud, obscuring the crumbling cottages that Marcus Thorne hadn't seen in 30 years. His German shepherd, Kaiser, whined uneasily as they approached the ruins of his childhood home, the same cottage where his family had vanished without a trace when he was just 12 years old. Marcus had built a new life in the capital, rising through the ranks to become the king's most trusted guard. But the nightmares never stopped. The questions never died. Now, with the king's blessing to investigate reports of strange lights in his birthplace, he'd finally returned to face his demons. Kaiser suddenly bolted toward the old well behind the cottage, pawing frantically at the moss-covered stones. When Marcus pulled away the debris, his blood turned to ice. There, wrapped in royal silk bearing the king's own seal, lay skeletal remains and a letter that made his hands tremble. The truth he uncovered would force him to choose between his loyalty to the crown and justice for his murdered family. But what Marcus didn't know was that someone had been watching, waiting for his return. What dark secret had the royal family buried in this forgotten village? And why were they willing to kill to keep it hidden? Marcus's weathered fingers trembled as he lifted the parchment from beside the bones. The royal seal cracked and flaked away like ancient blood. Kaiser circled the well's perimeter, his hackles raised, nose twitching at scents 30 years old, yet somehow still potent in the damp morning air. The letter bore his father's handwriting, script Marcus recognized from countless childhood memories of watching his father pen entries in his mysterious journal. But these words carried a weight that made Marcus's chest tighten with each line. To my son, should you ever return to this cursed place, the king's men came in the night. They discovered what I had learned about Prince Edmund's death. It was not bandits who killed the prince during that hunting expedition. The queen herself ordered his assassination when she learned of his plans to expose her involvement in the grain shortage that starved our people. They silenced him, and now they come for us. The villagers who knew the truth are already dead. I pray you escape to safety, my boy. Trust no one who wears the crown's colors. Your father. The parchment crumpled in Marcus's grip. Prince Edmund, the beloved royal who had died 15 years before Marcus was born, whose tragic death had launched a war against the neighboring kingdom. The official story claimed bandits had ambushed the prince's hunting party. That war had claimed thousands of lives, including Marcus's uncle and 2 cousins. Kaiser's barking snapped Marcus from his spiraling thoughts. The dog stood rigid beside a cluster of disturbed earth near the cottage's collapsed eastern wall. Marcus approached cautiously, his trained eye recognizing the telltale signs of recent excavation despite the hastily scattered leaves and debris. Someone had been here recently, very recently. Marcus knelt and brushed away the loose soil. His fingers struck something hard, wood polished smooth, a small chest ornately carved with symbols he didn't recognize. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay his father's journal and a collection of letters bearing different handwriting. The first letter made his breath catch. It was addressed to his father from someone identified only as the witness and detailed Queen Isabella's clandestine meetings with grain merchants, artificially inflating prices while the kingdom's poor starved. The second described Prince Edmund's discovery of these treacherous dealings and his intention to confront his mother publicly. But it was the third letter that sent ice through Marcus's veins. Written in the Queen's own distinctive script, penmanship he'd seen countless times on royal documents, it contained explicit orders for Prince Edmund's elimination and detailed plans for framing the neighboring kingdom to justify the subsequent war. The war that had made Queen Isabella's loyal supporters wealthy beyond measure through weapons contracts and territorial acquisitions. Marcus sank back on his heels, his 30-year career of unwavering service crashing down around him. He had fought in that war, had killed in that war, had watched good men die defending what they believed was justice for their murdered prince. All of it built on lies. Kaiser's low growl alerted him to movement in the tree line beyond the cottage. 3 figures emerged from the mist, men wearing the dark leather of the Queen's personal guard. Marcus recognized their leader, Captain Aldrich, a man he'd considered a friend and colleague for over a decade. "Stand down, Marcus," Aldrich called, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Her Majesty requests your immediate return to the capital." Marcus carefully tucked the letters inside his coat, his own sword sliding silently from its sheath. "I'm afraid I'll be delayed, Captain. There are matters here requiring my attention." Aldrich's expression hardened. "Those documents don't belong to you, old friend. Hand them over, and perhaps this can end quietly." The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. They knew exactly what he'd found, which meant they'd been watching, waiting for him to uncover his father's cache. Marcus glanced at the skeletal remains still partially visible in the well. His parents, he realized now, murdered for their dangerous knowledge. Kaiser moved to his side, teeth bared. Behind him, Marcus emerged from the tavern where they'd spent the night, stretching his massive frame and yawning loud enough to wake the dead. The wolfhound had claimed the entire hearth for himself, much to the amusement of Widow Brennan, who still ran the establishment despite her advancing years. "Sleep well?" Gareth asked without turning around. "Better than I have in months," Marcus replied, joining his friend at the square's center. "Amazing how quiet it is here. No horns, no shouting guards, no clatter of carriages on stone." He paused, studying Gareth's profile. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Several, actually." Gareth gestured toward a narrow alley between two abandoned buildings. "My father's smithy was there. Always thought I'd take it over someday, learn to shape iron instead of swing it." He pointed to another empty space. "Old Henrik's bakery, the man-made bread that could make angels weep." Marcus followed his gaze, noting the foundations still visible beneath the encroaching vegetation. What happened to them all? Time. Progress. The king's new roads brought trade through Thornwick instead, 20 miles east. Young folks left for opportunities in larger towns. The old ones, Gareth shrugged, well, they're in the churchyard now, most of them. They walked in comfortable silence through streets that felt more like memory than reality. Gareth's boots echoed hollowly on the few remaining patches of intact cobblestone, each step carrying him deeper into a past he'd tried to forget. The cottage where the blacksmith's daughter had lived, the one who'd promised to wait for him, gone. The school where Father Aldrich had taught him letters and numbers, roof collapsed, walls crumbling. "There," Gareth said suddenly, stopping before a modest stone house at the village's northern edge. "That's where I was born." The structure had fared better than most, its solid construction evident in the straight walls and intact roof. But ivy consumed half the facade, and the garden had become a tangle of wild roses and brambles. A wooden sign hung crooked by the gate, "Property of the Crown. No trespassing." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Crown property? That's unusual for a private residence." "Very unusual." Gareth's voice carried an edge that hadn't been there moments before. "My family owned this land for 4 generations. When I left for the capital, my parents were still young, still healthy. The house should have passed to my sister when they died. What happened to your sister?" "I don't know. The admission tasted bitter. I sent letters for the first few years, but they came back undelivered. Eventually I stopped trying. Assumed they'd moved on, forgotten about their soldier son who chose duty over family." Marcus studied the official seal pressed into the wax that secured the property notice. "This proclamation is dated 15 years ago, seized for unpaid debts to the Crown. Signed by," he squinted at the faded text, "Lord Aldwyn Voss." The name hit Gareth like a physical blow. Lord Voss, the king's chief advisor, a man he'd served and protected countless times. A man who'd never mentioned knowing Gareth's family or having any connection to this forgotten village. "That's impossible," Gareth muttered. "My father was a blacksmith, not a merchant. He never dealt with royal contracts or taxes significant enough to involve someone of Voss's standing." "Unless he discovered something he shouldn't have," Marcus suggested quietly. "You said yourself this place felt wrong. What if your family stumbled onto something that threatened the wrong people?" Before Gareth could respond, a low growl rumbled from beside the house. They turned to see Marcus, the dog, standing rigid near an old well, hackles raised and ears pinned back. The wolfhound's massive head pointed toward the ground, and his growl intensified. "Easy, boy," Marcus the man called. "What's got you spooked?" But the dog didn't move, didn't acknowledge his master's voice. Instead, he began to dig, his powerful claws tearing at the earth with desperate urgency. Dirt flew in all directions as he worked, his growls transforming into urgent whines. "Marcus, call him off," Gareth said, but his voice lacked conviction. Something about the dog's behavior sent ice through his veins, a primal warning that whatever lay beneath that innocent-looking patch of ground was better left undisturbed. The wolfhound's digging grew more frantic, and then suddenly he stopped, backing away from the hole with a whimper. In the disturbed earth, something white gleamed in the morning sunlight. Gareth knelt beside the excavation, his hand trembling as he brushed away loose soil. His breath caught as familiar metal winked up at him, a signet ring bearing the crest of his family, wrapped around bones that had been hidden in the dark for far too long. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones like guilty secrets as Marcus made his way through Millhaven's narrow streets. 3 decades had changed little here. The same weathered faces peered from doorways, though lined now with years he'd missed. Children who should have been his neighbor's grandchildren watched him with curious eyes, whispering among themselves about the stranger with the royal insignia. He'd left his ceremonial armor at the inn, choosing instead the simple brown leather of a traveling merchant. Still, his bearing gave him away. A lifetime of palace discipline couldn't be shed like an uncomfortable coat. The baker's shop stood where he remembered it, though Henrik's son now worked the ovens. The blacksmith still rang his hammer in the same rhythm that had lulled Marcus to sleep as a boy. Even the old well in the market square bore the same crack along its stone rim, a fissure he'd helped create during a childhood game gone wrong. But it was the silence that unsettled him most. Not the absence of sound, but the weight of unspoken words. Conversations died when he approached. Eyes darted away from his face as if burned by recognition. "You're Garrett's boy." Marcus turned to find an elderly woman studying him with rheumy eyes. Her gnarled hands gripped a walking stick carved from oak, the same wood that grew in the forests surrounding Millhaven. "I am," he said, offering a slight bow. "Though I fear I don't remember." "Marta, I helped birth you." Her gaze swept over his tall frame, taking in the sword at his hip, the quality of his boots. "Your mother screamed for 14 hours bringing you into this world. Wondered sometimes if you'd ever amount to anything." The words might have stung, if not for the faint smile playing at her lips. "And did I amount to anything?" Marta's expression darkened. "That depends on what you've come back to do." Before Marcus could respond, she turned away, her walking stick tapping against the stones with each labored step. The sound echoed long after she'd disappeared around a corner, leaving him with more questions than answers. The house stood at the village's edge, smaller than memory had painted it. The thatched roof sagged in places, and ivy had claimed much of the western wall. The garden his mother had tended with such care had surrendered to weeds and time. Rex padded beside him, occasionally lifting his muzzle to test the air. The dog's unease had only grown stronger since their arrival, as if he sensed something Marcus's human senses couldn't detect. The front door hung slightly ajar. Marcus pushed it open, wincing as rusted hinges announced his presence with a prolonged groan. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that penetrated gaps in the shuttered windows. The air tasted stale, forgotten. His parents' few possessions remained largely undisturbed, a testament to Millhaven's honesty, or perhaps something else entirely. Who would want the belongings of the dead when they carried such shadows? In the kitchen, his mother's cast-iron pot still sat on the cold hearth. His father's fishing nets hung from wooden pegs, their mesh patterns creating intricate shadows on the wall. Everything waited as if expecting their owner's return. Rex had wandered into the back room, and Marcus heard him whining, a low, troubled sound that raised the hair on his arms. Following the noise, he found the dog pawing at a loose floorboard near the window. "What is it, boy?" The board lifted easily, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a leather-bound journal and a silver medallion Marcus had never seen before. The medallion bore an intricate design, a tree with roots that seemed to twist into the shape of a crown. His hands trembled as he opened the journal. His father's careful script filled the pages, documenting events that made Marcus's blood run cold. Meetings held in midnight darkness, gold-changing hands, names he recognized from palace corridors. And there, on a page near the journal's end, his own name written in his father's hand, "Marcus must never know. The boy's future depends on our silence." A shadow fell across the doorway. Marcus looked up to find a figure silhouetted against the afternoon light, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the colors of the Royal Guard. Captain Sterling. The voice was familiar, though Marcus couldn't immediately place it. "His Majesty sends his regards." Marcus carefully closed the journal, his mind racing. "How did you know where to find me?" "The crown has many eyes, as you well know." The figure stepped into the room, and Marcus recognized Lieutenant Gareth Thorne, a man 20 years his junior but ambitious beyond his age. "The question is, what have you found that requires the king's attention?" Rex growled low in his throat, positioning himself between Marcus and the doorway. The dog's instincts had proven reliable over the years, and Marcus felt his own hand drift toward his sword hilt. "Nothing that concerns the crown," Marcus said carefully. Thorne's smile held no warmth. "I'm afraid that decision isn't yours to make." The morning mist clung to the cobblestones like guilty whispers as Marcus made his way through the village's narrow streets. Sleep had eluded him entirely, his mind churning over Tobias's cryptic warnings and the strange tension that seemed to permeate every corner of his childhood home. The place felt wrong somehow, as if the very foundations had shifted during his 30-year absence. He paused outside the blacksmith's forge, now cold and abandoned, its chimney dark against the pale sky. Old Henrik had worked these bellows when Marcus was a boy, crafting horseshoes and farm tools with practiced precision. The man would be long dead now, but seeing the empty workspace stirred something uncomfortable in Marcus's chest. "You're up early for a man celebrating his homecoming." Marcus turned to find a woman watching him from the doorway of what had once been the baker's shop. She was perhaps 40, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue his every movement. There was something familiar about her face, though he couldn't place it. "I've grown accustomed to soldiers' hours," he replied carefully. "I'm afraid I don't—" "Elara Thorne," she said, stepping closer. "Though you knew me as Elara Moss before I married, I was Henrik's apprentice when you left." The memories surfaced slowly. A gangly girl with soot-stained aprons who used to watch him practice swordplay behind the forge. She'd been perhaps 12 then, all elbows and curiosity. "You took over the smithy," he observed. "Someone had to." Her tone carried an edge that made him study her more closely. "Henrik died the winter after you left. Fever took him," they said. "Left me with half-learned skills and a village that needed tools mended. I'm sorry. He was a good man." Elara's laugh held no humor. Good men seem to have short lives in Millbrook these days. Henrik, the old priest Father Aldwin, the previous village headman, all dead within 5 years of your departure. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "That's unfortunate, but hardly unusual for a small village. People age, accidents happen." "Do they?" Elara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Tell me, Sir Marcus, in your 3 decades of service to the crown, how often have you encountered coincidences of such precision?" Before Marcus could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the surrounding buildings. 3 riders materialized from the mist, their horses' breath steaming in the cool air. The lead rider bore the crimson and gold livery of the Royal Messenger Service. "Sir Marcus Blackwood," the messenger's voice carried the authority of the crown. "I am he." The young man dismounted and approached with a sealed scroll. "Orders from the capital, sir. Priority dispatch." Marcus broke the royal seal with growing unease. His eyes scanned the parchment quickly, his expression darkening with each line. When he finished, he looked up to find both the messenger and Ilara watching him intently. "You're to return immediately?" Ilara asked, reading his face with uncomfortable accuracy. "Yes." Marcus folded the orders carefully. "It seems my leave has been curtailed." "How convenient," she murmured. "Your friend Tobias was asking questions at the tavern last night. About the old days, about people who used to live here. Perhaps someone felt uncomfortable with his curiosity." Marcus's hand instinctively moved to his sword hilt. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that some secrets have powerful guardians." Ilara glanced meaningfully at the royal messengers, who showed no signs of departing despite having completed their delivery. "And some homecomings are less welcome than they appear." "Sir Marcus," the lead messenger interrupted, "we're instructed to provide escort back to the capital. For your safety, of course." The phrase hung in the air like a blade. Marcus had received enough royal orders to recognize a polite imprisonment when he heard one. His mind raced, weighing options and calculating risks. "Of course," he said finally. "I'll need time to gather my belongings and say farewell to my companion. Naturally, we'll accompany you." As they made their way back toward the inn, Ilara fell into step beside Marcus, her voice barely audible. "The old well behind Henrik's forge. If your friend truly wishes to understand what happened here, tell him to look there. But warn him, once some doors are opened, they can never be closed again." She peeled away at the next corner, leaving Marcus to walk the final distance with his royal escorts. As they approached the inn, he could see Tobias through an upper window, still examining whatever documents he'd discovered the night before. Marcus felt the weight of 30 years of loyalty pressing down on him like a physical burden. He had served his kingdom faithfully, without question, believing in the righteousness of his cause. But as the inn's door swung open to reveal Tobias's eager, trusting face, Marcus realized that faith and truth were not always the same thing. The morning mist clung to the village like a shroud as Marcus made his way through the narrow streets, each footstep echoing memories he'd tried to bury. 30 years in the Royal Guard had taught him to read danger in the smallest details: a curtain twitching, a door left ajar, the way shadows fell differently than they should. Now, every familiar corner of his childhood home whispered warnings he couldn't quite decipher. Tobias had been unusually restless since dawn, pacing the small room at the inn with an energy that spoke of discovery. The old bloodhound rarely showed such agitation without cause, and Marcus had learned long ago to trust his companion's instincts more than his own rational mind. "What is it, old friend?" Marcus murmured, watching as Tobias sniffed the air near the window. The dog's hackles rose slightly, a barely perceptible sign that would have meant nothing to most observers. But Marcus had spent 15 years reading every nuance of his partner's behavior. The village of Millhaven looked peaceful enough in the pale morning light. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in the dusty streets, and merchants prepared their stalls for the day's trade. Yet something felt wrong, a tension that reminded Marcus of those moments before battle when the very air seemed to hold its breath. His mother's cottage stood at the village's edge, exactly as he remembered it, though time had weathered the wooden shutters and moss now claimed portions of the roof. He'd avoided visiting it since his return 3 days ago, unwilling to confront the ghosts that surely waited within those walls. But Tobias had led him here with purpose, nose to the ground, following some invisible trail that grew stronger with each step. The front door stood slightly open, though Marcus was certain it had been locked when he'd passed by yesterday. His hand instinctively moved to the sword at his hip as he pushed the door wider, the familiar creak of old hinges sending a chill down his spine. "Mother?" The word escaped before he could stop it, a foolish hope that 3 decades hadn't managed to kill entirely. She'd been dead for 28 years, a fever that took half the village, according to the letter that had reached him at the capital. The cottage's interior lay in shadows, dust motes dancing in the narrow beams of sunlight that penetrated the grimy windows. Everything remained exactly as he remembered: the rough-hewn table where his mother had kneaded bread, the stone hearth where she'd told him stories of knights and dragons, the wooden chest where she'd kept her few precious belongings. Tobias moved past him with renewed urgency, heading straight for the back corner of the main room. The dog began to whine, a low sound that raised the hair on Marcus's neck. In all their years together, through battles and investigations, through the darkest moments of their service to the crown, he'd never heard Tobias make that particular sound. Following his companion, Marcus knelt beside the dog near what appeared to be ordinary floorboards. But Tobias was pawing at a specific spot, his claws scratching against wood that sounded different, hollow. Marcus ran his hands along the boards until he found what Tobias had detected, a section that moved slightly under pressure, concealed hinges barely visible in the poor light. His mother had been a simple village woman, a baker's widow with no secrets worth hiding. What could possibly be beneath her floor? The hidden compartment opened with surprising ease, revealing a space just large enough to hold a leather satchel that looked far too expensive for his mother's modest circumstances. Marcus lifted it with trembling hands, noting the royal seal pressed into the leather, a seal that shouldn't have existed anywhere in this forgotten village. Inside the satchel lay documents that made his blood run cold. Letters bearing the king's personal signature, written in the same hand Marcus had seen countless times during his service. But these were dated 31 years ago, just before Marcus had left Millhaven to join the Royal Guard. The addressee line on each letter made his vision blur, "My dearest Elena," his mother's name. The letters spoke of love, of promises, of a child who must be protected at all costs. They spoke of arrangements made in shadow, of a Royal Guard position secured through influence rather than merit, of a secret that could never see light. Marcus sank back on his heels, the letters scattered around him like fallen leaves. Every certainty of his life, every moment of pride in his achievements, every belief about his identity crumbled in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Tobias pressed against his side, offering the only comfort possible in a moment when the very foundations of reality had shifted. Outside, the village continued its peaceful morning routine, unaware that their returned hero had just discovered he might be the bastard son of the king he'd sworn to serve. The kingdom's greatest secret hadn't died with his mother after all. The morning mist clung to the village like a shroud as Marcus made his way through the narrow streets, each step echoing with memories he'd tried to forget. 30 years had changed everything and nothing. The cobblestones were cracked now, weeds growing between them like fingers reaching from the earth. But the layout remained etched in his mind like a map drawn in childhood. Behind him, he could hear Tobias sniffing at something near the old well. The hound had been restless since their arrival, nose constantly to the ground, following scents that seemed to agitate him. Marcus had learned to trust his companion's instincts over the years. They'd served him well in the capital, where courtly intrigue was as dangerous as any battlefield. "What is it, boy?" Marcus called softly, not wanting to wake the handful of villagers who still called this place home. The population had dwindled from nearly 200 in his youth to perhaps 30 souls now, mostly the elderly and those too poor to seek fortune elsewhere. Tobias whined, pawing at the earth near the well's base. The stone structure was ancient, older than the village itself, dating back to the first settlements in this region. Marcus remembered drinking from it as a child, the water always cold and sweet. Now the wooden bucket hung broken, and moss covered the stones like a green disease. The sight stirred something uncomfortable in Marcus's chest. He'd left this place as a 17-year-old boy, desperate to escape the suffocating poverty and make something of himself. The Royal Guard had offered everything he'd dreamed of: purpose, honor, a chance to serve something greater than himself. He'd never looked back, not even when his mother died 5 years later. The letter had reached him at the border fortress where he was stationed, but duty had kept him from returning even for her funeral. Now, standing in the shadow of his childhood, he wondered what kind of man that made him. Tobias's whining grew more insistent. The dog had begun digging now, his powerful claws scraping against the hard-packed earth. Marcus approached, intending to call him off, but stopped when he saw what the animal had uncovered. A piece of cloth, faded and stained, protruded from the shallow hole Tobias had excavated. It was fine material, silk by the look of it, though years in the ground had dulled its original color. This wasn't the rough homespun that villagers wore. This was court dress, the kind worn by nobility. Marcus's blood chilled. He knelt beside Tobias, his trained eye taking in details that would escape a civilian's notice. The fabric hadn't been buried randomly. It was part of something larger, something that had been deliberately concealed. And beneath the earthy smell of disturbed soil, there was something else, something that made his stomach turn. "Good boy," he whispered to Tobias, though his voice was strained. "Good boy, now come away." But the hound was possessed by whatever he'd found. His digging became frantic, sending clods of earth flying. Marcus reached for the dog's collar, then froze as more of the burial site was revealed. Bones, yellowed with age but unmistakably human. And wrapped around them, more of that fine silk, along with something that made Marcus's world tilt on its axis, a golden pendant bearing the royal seal. His hands trembled as he pulled Tobias back from the excavation. The pendant was one he recognized, one that had been reported stolen from the royal treasury 31 years ago. The theft had caused an uproar in the capital, leading to investigations, accusations, and the eventual exile of several minor nobles who had been unable to prove their innocence. But here it was, buried in his childhood village, wrapped around the remains of someone who had clearly been murdered and hastily hidden. Marcus's mind raced through the implications. 31 years ago, he would have been 16, still a year away from leaving for the capital. But he remembered that time well, remembered the strange visitors who had come to the village that autumn, well-dressed travelers who had claimed to be merchants but carried themselves like courtiers. They had stayed for 3 days, asking questions about the old roads and the mountain passes that led to the northern kingdoms. And then they had vanished, leaving only rumors and the villagers' gossip about their strange behavior and expensive clothes. Now he understood why they had never been seen leaving. Behind him, a twig snapped. Marcus spun, his hand instinctively moving to where his sword would hang, though he wore only traveling clothes now. An old woman stood at the edge of the square, watching him with eyes that held far too much knowledge. "So you found them at last," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "I wondered when someone would come looking. I wondered when the past would finally catch up with us all." Marcus recognized her then, Elder Marta, who had been ancient even when he was a boy, still alive, still watching, still keeping the village's secrets. And from the look in her eyes, she had been expecting him. The ancient oak stood like a sentinel against the pre-dawn darkness, its gnarled roots creating natural alcoves where secrets might hide. Gareth knelt beside the base of the tree, his weathered hands brushing away decades of accumulated earth and debris. The metal detector's urgent beeping had led them here, to this forgotten corner of the village cemetery where headstones leaned at drunken angles and wild grass grew waist-high. "Here," he whispered to Marcus, who stood watch with his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Something's definitely buried here, and it's not natural to this place." Marcus felt the familiar weight of dread settling in his stomach. 3 days had passed since they'd begun their investigation into the village's dark history, and each revelation had drawn them deeper into a web of conspiracy that seemed to reach all the way to the palace itself. The symbols they'd found carved into the old well, the mysterious disappearances that the current villagers spoke of only in hushed tones, the way certain families had inexplicably prospered while others had vanished entirely. It all pointed to something far more sinister than simple rural decline. Gareth's shovel struck something solid with a metallic clang. Both men froze, listening to ensure their midnight excavation hadn't attracted unwanted attention. The village slept on, oblivious to the earth being disturbed in their sacred ground. "A chest," Gareth breathed, clearing more soil away. Iron-bound by the feel of it, old. Marcus crouched beside his friend, helping to unearth their discovery. The chest was smaller than expected, roughly the size of a man's torso, but heavy enough to require both of them to lift it from its earthen prison. Intricate engravings covered its surface, the same twisted symbols they'd seen before, intertwined with what looked like royal crests from a bygone era. They carried their burden back to the abandoned cottage they'd been using as a base of operations, carefully avoiding the main roads and the prying eyes of early rising farmers. Inside, by the light of a single oil lamp, Marcus examined the chest's lock mechanism while Gareth kept watch at the window. "I've seen this craftsmanship before," Marcus said, his voice tight with recognition. "This is palace work. Royal artisans made this, probably 2 or 3 generations ago." His fingers traced the elaborate metalwork, noting details that would be meaningless to most but spoke volumes to someone who'd spent 30 years within the kingdom's inner circles. The lock yielded to Gareth's patient ministrations. Apparently, his skills extended beyond finding buried objects. As the lid creaked open, both men leaned forward, and Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Documents. Dozens of them, perfectly preserved in oiled leather wrappings. Royal seals gleamed in the lamplight, authentic and unmistakable. Marcus recognized the signatures before his mind fully processed their implications. 3 successive kings, including the current monarch's grandfather, all parties to whatever agreements these papers contained. "Can you read them?" Gareth asked, noting his friend's sudden pallor. Marcus lifted the top document with trembling hands. The formal language of court was familiar to him, but the content made him wish he'd never learned to read at all. "It's a treaty," he said slowly, "between the crown and this village, but not the village as we know it." His eyes scanned the archaic terms, translating the political doublespeak into horrible clarity. "Gareth, this place wasn't forgotten by accident. It was deliberately erased from all records as part of some kind of arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Marcus continued reading, his training allowing him to piece together the bureaucratic language into a coherent narrative. What emerged was a picture of systematic exploitation that had continued for decades. The village had been used as a testing ground for policies too controversial to implement elsewhere, its population treated as expendable subjects in political experiments that had sometimes turned deadly. "They used this place," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The crown used these people as guinea pigs, testing new forms of taxation, new legal codes, even military strategies. When things went wrong, when people died or disappeared, they'd simply cover it up and try again." The second document was worse. It detailed financial arrangements, blood money really, paid to certain village leaders in exchange for their silence and cooperation. The amounts were staggering, enough to explain why some families had prospered while others suffered. There had been collaborators, villagers who'd sold out their neighbors for royal gold. Gareth sank into a chair, the weight of revelation crushing his usual optimism. "My family," he said hoarsely. "My parents, my sister. They weren't just casualties of hard times. They were murdered by policy." Marcus wanted to offer comfort, but there was more. The final document bore yesterday's date, a renewal order, signed by the current king himself. The program had never ended. It had simply been transferred to other forgotten places, other expendable communities scattered throughout the kingdom. The very crown he'd sworn to protect had been built on systematic atrocity, and it was still happening. The morning mist clung to the village like a shroud as Gareth made his way through the narrow streets, each step echoing with memories he'd tried to bury. 3 decades had changed little here. The same weathered stone houses, the same crooked fences, the same suspicious glances from windows. But something felt different now, charged with an undercurrent of danger that made his hand drift instinctively toward his sword. Marcus had been acting strangely since their arrival 2 days ago. The old hound, usually content to rest by the fire, had taken to wandering off at odd hours, returning with dirt caked under his claws and an intensity in his amber eyes that Gareth hadn't seen since their campaigning days. Last night, Marcus had scratched at the door until Gareth let him out. then disappeared into the darkness beyond the village borders. The tavern keeper, Willem, looked up nervously as Gareth entered the common room. The man's hands trembled as he wiped down a mug that was already clean. "Any word of my companion?" Gareth asked, settling onto a worn wooden stool. Willem shook his head too quickly. "Nothing, Sir Gareth, though—" He hesitated, glancing toward the stairs leading to the upper rooms. "Old Marta was asking after you, said she has something that belonged to your family." Gareth's blood chilled. Marta had been ancient when he was a boy, somehow still clinging to life like ivy on a crumbling wall. If anyone remembered the events that had driven him from this place, it would be her. The stairs creaked under his weight as he climbed to the small room where Marta waited. She sat hunched by a narrow window, her fingers working at a piece of faded embroidery. When she looked up, her milky eyes seemed to see straight through him. "Gareth Blackstone," she wheezed, "though you wear the king's colours now, don't you? Royal Guard, they say. How far you've risen from the ashes." Her laugh was like dry leaves scraping stone. "Your family." "Yes, they left quite a legacy, didn't they?" She reached beneath her shawl and produced a small wooden box, its surface carved with symbols that made Gareth's stomach lurch with recognition. "Found this when they tore down your father's workshop. Been keeping it safe all these years, waiting for you to come home." Gareth stared at the box, afraid to touch it. "My father was a blacksmith, nothing more." "Was he now?" Marta's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Then why did men in royal livery come asking questions about his work? Why did your family disappear in the night, leaving only blood on the workshop floor?" The room seemed to spin around him. "You're mistaken, old woman. My parents died of fever." "Did they? Or did they discover something they weren't meant to know? Something about the swords your father was commissioned to forge, perhaps? Swords for a very special purpose." Before Gareth could respond, a familiar bark echoed from the street below. Marcus stood in the village square, his fur matted with earth and something clutched in his massive jaws. Even from this distance, Gareth could see the urgency in his companion's posture. "Go to your hound," Marta whispered, "but take this with you. The truth has a way of surfacing, whether we will it or not." Gareth grabbed the box and raced downstairs, pushing through the gathering crowd in the square. Marcus dropped his burden at Gareth's feet and whined low in his throat. It was a piece of metal, corroded and ancient, but unmistakably part of a sword hilt. Royal insignia were barely visible beneath the rust. "Where did you find this?" Gareth demanded, but Marcus was already moving, leading him toward the old forest path that wound past his childhood home. They walked in tense silence, until Marcus stopped beside a depression in the earth, clearly where he'd been digging. The hole was deeper than Gareth had expected, and at the bottom, partially exposed, lay the remains of a wooden chest. But it wasn't the chest that made his blood freeze. It was the human skull resting beside it, a jagged crack running through the bone. With trembling hands, Gareth opened Marta's box. Inside lay documents bearing the royal seal, written in his father's careful script. As he read, the terrible truth unfolded like a poisonous flower. His father hadn't been a simple blacksmith. He'd been commissioned to forge weapons for a secret order within the Royal Guard, weapons intended for a coup against the rightful king. The skull belonged to the messenger who'd tried to warn the crown. His father had killed him, then hidden the evidence before fleeing with his family, but someone had found them, silenced them before they could escape entirely. Gareth sank to his knees beside the grave, understanding flooding through him like ice water. He'd spent 30 years serving the very throne his father had betrayed, never knowing that the blood of treason ran in his veins. And now, with these bones unearthed and the truth exposed, everything he'd built would crumble to dust. Marcus pressed against him, sensing his anguish, as the weight of inherited sins settled on Gareth's shoulders like a funeral shroud. The storm that had threatened all evening finally broke as Marcus and Finn made their way through the village's winding back alleys. Rain drummed against the thatched roofs above them, creating a symphony that masked their footsteps on the cobblestones. Marcus pulled his cloak tighter, grateful for the weather's concealment as they approached the old miller's house where Ilara waited. She opened the door before they could knock, her weathered face grave in the candlelight. "Come quickly," she whispered, ushering them inside. "There are things you must see before dawn breaks." The interior of her cottage was sparse but warm, filled with the lingering scent of herbs and old parchment. Finn shook the rain from his coat, his keen eyes already scanning the room with practiced wariness. On the rough wooden table lay several items that made Marcus's blood run cold: a royal seal, tarnished with age, a leather-bound journal, and what appeared to be a fragment of silk bearing the royal crest. "Where did you find these?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ilara's hands trembled as she lit another candle, hidden beneath the floorboards of my father's old workshop. He was the village carpenter then, built most of the homes you see today, but he also built other things, secret things, when the gold was right and the questions were few. Finn approached the table, his experienced fingers hovering over the artifacts without touching them. "This seal bears the mark of Prince Aldrich, the king's younger brother who died 30 years ago." He looked up sharply at Marcus, the same Prince Aldrich whose death secured the current king's claim to the throne. Marcus felt the familiar weight of his sword at his hip, but it brought no comfort now. He had sworn his oath to King Roderick, had served him faithfully for 3 decades, believing in the righteousness of his cause. Prince Aldrich died in a hunting accident. I was there when the news reached the capital. "Were you there when it happened?" Ilara asked pointedly. "Or only when the story was told?" The old woman opened the journal with reverent care, its pages crackling with age. My father kept meticulous records of his work. Every beam cut, every joint fitted, every secret commission fulfilled. "Look here." She pointed to an entry dated 31 years ago, written in fading ink. Marcus leaned closer, his heart hammering as he read the careful script aloud. "Commission from Lord Garrett, private chamber beneath the old granary, payment 50 gold pieces. Note, work to be completed in absolute secrecy, no apprentices, no witnesses." Lord Garrett was Prince Aldrich's most trusted advisor, Finn said grimly. "He died of fever shortly after the prince's supposed accident. Very convenient timing." Ilara turned several pages deeper into the journal. "But that's not the worst of it. Look at this entry, made 1 month later." Marcus's vision blurred as he read the next passage. His father's handwriting described the construction of a hidden room, complete with air vents and a concealed entrance. But the final line made his stomach turn: "Chamber sealed by Lord Garrett's order. May God forgive us all for what we've hidden beneath the earth." "You think Prince Aldrich was murdered and hidden here?" Marcus said, his voice hollow. "I think your village was chosen for a reason," Finn replied, studying the silk fragment. "Remote enough to avoid scrutiny, small enough to control, and with craftsmen skilled enough to build the perfect tomb." Thunder crashed overhead, and in the distance Marcus could hear horses approaching. His soldier's instincts kicked in immediately. Someone's coming, multiple riders, moving fast despite the storm. Ilara quickly gathered the artifacts, wrapping them in oiled cloth. "Take these. The granary stands at the village's eastern edge, abandoned these past 10 years. If my father's work still stands, you'll find your answers there." "What about you?" Marcus asked, but the old woman was already moving toward the back of the cottage. "I've lived long enough to know when to disappear," she said with a sad smile. "But you, Sir Marcus, you have a choice to make. You can serve the crown that was bought with murder, or you can serve the truth that's been buried with the rightful king." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by the jingle of mail and weapons. Royal Guards, Marcus realized with growing dread. Someone had discovered their investigation. Finn was already at the back window, checking their escape route. "We need to move, now." Marcus took the wrapped artifacts, their weight seeming far heavier than their physical mass. 30 years of loyal service, 30 years of believing he served justice and righteousness, and now this. If Prince Aldrich truly lay buried in this forgotten village, then everything Marcus had fought for, everyone he had killed in the king's name, had been built on a foundation of lies and murder. The granary, he said to Finn as they slipped out into the storm-lashed night. "We finish this tonight." Behind them, torchlight flickered through Ilara's windows as the Royal Guards arrived, but the cottage was already empty, holding only shadows and the lingering scent of secrets finally brought to light. The royal seal felt heavier in Marcus's weathered hands than it had any right to. 3 decades of faithful service, and now he held evidence that could unravel everything he'd believed about the crown he'd sworn to protect. The parchment crinkled as his fingers trembled, each word a dagger thrust into his loyalty. Tobias watched from across the dusty chamber, his amber eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. The old hound had led him here, through the maze of forgotten tunnels beneath the village church, to this sealed room that shouldn't have existed. Now they both stared at the impossible truth scattered across the ancient desk. Birth records, death certificates, land deeds bearing forged signatures, and at the center of it all, a confession written in the trembling hand of Father Willem, dated just 3 days before his mysterious death 30 years ago. "The true heir lives," Marcus read aloud, his voice barely a whisper in the tomb-like silence. "Prince Aldrich did not perish in the plague, as proclaimed throughout the kingdom. The boy was hidden here, in Millbrook, raised as one of our own. I have kept this secret for 7 years, but I fear my silence has become complicity in a greater crime." Marcus set the letter down with deliberate care, his mind reeling. Prince Aldrich, King Roderick's younger brother, whose death had cleared the path to the throne. The official record spoke of a swift illness during the plague years, a tragedy that had devastated the royal family. But this letter painted a different picture entirely. Tobias padded closer, resting his grizzled head against Marcus's knee. The gesture was oddly comforting, an anchor of warmth in a world suddenly turned upside down. Marcus scratched behind the dog's ears absently, his gaze fixed on another document, a detailed family tree that traced bloodlines through generations of Millbrook residents. There, circled in red ink, was a name that made Marcus's blood freeze: Thomas Fletcher, the blacksmith's son who'd been his closest childhood friend, the boy who'd died in the same fire that had claimed Marcus's family, driving him from the village and into royal service. Except according to Father Willem's careful notes, Thomas Fletcher had been born Aldrich Thorne, rightful heir to a throne that another man's son now occupied. The implications crashed over Marcus like a collapsing wall. If Prince Aldrich had lived, hidden in plain sight, then King Roderick's entire reign was built on a foundation of lies and murder. The plague had been convenient cover for assassination, and Father Willem had been the sole guardian of a secret that could topple the kingdom. A secret that had gotten him killed. Marcus rose abruptly, pacing the cramped confines of the hidden chamber. The walls seemed to press closer with each revelation, centuries of stone and shadow bearing witness to a conspiracy that reached the very heart of the realm. His boots stirred clouds of dust from the floor, disturbing the perfect silence that had preserved these damning truths. But something else nagged at him, a discordant note in the symphony of betrayal. If Thomas, Prince Aldrich, was dead, burned alive in that terrible fire, then what did it matter? The rightful king was beyond justice or restoration, another ghost in a village full of them. The throne would remain where it was, regardless of the sins that had placed it there, unless the prince had somehow survived. The thought struck Marcus like lightning, illuminating connections he'd been too blind to see. The mysterious figure watching from the forest shadows, the careful questions from villagers about his past, about why he'd really returned, the way certain people looked at him, not with the deference due a royal guard, but with something that might have been recognition. Tobias whined softly, ears perked toward the tunnel entrance. Footsteps echoed from the darkness beyond, measured and deliberate. Someone else knew about this place, knew what they'd discovered. Marcus's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt as he stepped protectively in front of the damning evidence. A figure emerged from the shadows, hood drawn up against the chamber's flickering light. For a moment, Marcus saw only an outline, a phantom given flesh. Then the stranger reached up and pulled back the hood, revealing a face that belonged to the dead. "Hello, Marcus," said Thomas Fletcher, "very much alive despite 30 years in the grave. I see you've found my father's legacy at last." The resemblance to the old king was unmistakable now that Marcus knew to look for it. The strong jaw, the penetrating grey eyes, the bearing of someone born to command. This was Prince Aldrich Thorne, rightful heir to the kingdom, standing in a forgotten tomb beneath the village where he'd supposedly died. Marcus found his voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a croak. "How long have you known who I really am?" Thomas Aldrich smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The better question, old friend, is how long you've known who you are. Did you really think your return to Millbrook was coincidence?" The ancient stone beneath their feet hummed with an energy that made Marcus's teeth ache. Torchlight danced across walls covered in symbols that predated the kingdom by centuries, perhaps millennia. Each step deeper into the underground chamber felt like descending through layers of forgotten time. "These markings," Ilara whispered, running her fingers along the carved stone. "They're not just decorative, they're instructions." Marcus kept his sword drawn, though he wasn't sure what good steel would do against whatever secrets lay buried here. The air tasted of copper and old earth, with something else underneath, something that reminded him of the royal crypts beneath the capital's cathedral. Thomas emerged from a shadowed alcove, his face pale in the flickering light. "You need to see this," he said, his voice barely audible. "Both of you." They followed him deeper into the chamber, past columns that twisted upward like frozen screams. The walls here were different, smoother, as if shaped by hands rather than tools. In the center of the space stood a raised platform, and upon it lay a stone sarcophagus. But it wasn't the tomb that made Marcus's blood run cold. It was what surrounded it. Dozens of smaller stone tablets were arranged in precise circles around the sarcophagus, each one bearing the royal seal of the Valorian dynasty. Marcus had seen that seal countless times, had worn it on his own armor for 30 years. But these seals were wrong somehow, older versions, with subtle differences that made his trained eye itch. "A true history," Ilara breathed, moving toward the nearest tablet. "Marcus, these are official records, royal chronicles that were supposedly lost in the great fire of King Aldrich's reign." Marcus approached one of the tablets, his torch casting long shadows across the ancient text. The words were written in Old Valorian, a language he could read thanks to his court education. What he read made his hands tremble. In the 13th year of King Aldrich the Just, the village of Thornwick was chosen for the great binding. The bloodline of the ancients, long thought extinct, was discovered among the common folk. By royal decree and sacred necessity, the village was. The text broke off, the stone cracked and weathered. Marcus moved to another tablet, his heart hammering against his ribs. "The crown's survival depends upon the continuation of the ancient pact. Every generation, the blood must be renewed. The chosen village serves not as subjects, but as vessels for the old power that keeps our enemies at bay." "Marcus!" Thomas's voice cut through his growing horror. "Look at this one." The tablet Thomas indicated was newer than the others, the stone less weathered. The text was clearer, more recent. Marcus read aloud, his voice growing hoarse with each word. "In the 5th year of Queen Isidora's reign, the village of Thornwick showed signs of awakening. The bloodline grows strong. Preparations must be made for the next binding before the power turns against the crown." Ilara had moved to examine the sarcophagus itself. "There's an inscription here," she called softly. "It's in the old tongue, but I can make out some of it. Something about a bargain struck in darkness, a price paid in blood and silence." Marcus felt the chamber spinning around him. The loyal soldier in him wanted to deny what he was reading, to find some explanation that preserved everything he'd believed about his kingdom, his queen, his purpose. But the evidence was literally carved in stone around him. "The attacks on the village," he said slowly, pieces clicking together in his mind like a lock opening. "They weren't random, they were harvesting operations." Thomas nodded grimly. "Looking for something specific, someone specific." "But what changed?" Ilara asked, moving back toward them. These tablets suggest this has been going on for generations. Why is Thornwick being destroyed now instead of used? Marcus closed his eyes, remembering conversations at court, snippets of discussion he'd overheard but never questioned. Queen Isadora's growing paranoia about threats to the kingdom, her increased reliance on the court mages, the way she'd looked when she'd granted him leave to visit his birthplace, not dismissive, but calculating. "Because the binding is failing," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Whatever power the crown has been drawing from these bloodlines, it's not working anymore. The old magic is dying out or fighting back." A sound echoed through the chamber, the scrape of stone against stone. All three of them froze, listening. It came again, from somewhere above them. "We need to go," Thomas whispered urgently. "Now." But Marcus was staring at the final tablet, the one closest to the sarcophagus. The text was different here, written in a hand he recognized from royal documents he'd carried as a messenger decades ago. Queen Isadora's own writing. "The Thornwick line must end. The old blood has become poison in our veins. Better to destroy the village entirely than risk the awakening of what sleeps beneath." The scraping sound came again, closer now. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving with the practiced silence of soldiers. They'd been found. The ancient parchment crackled between Aldrich's weathered fingers as he spread it across the dusty table in his childhood home. The seal he'd broken moments ago, the royal seal of House Valemont, lay in crimson fragments beside the document. His hands trembled not from age, but from the magnitude of what he was reading. "Gareth," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the candlelit room. "Come here." His faithful hound padded over from where he'd been sniffing at a loose floorboard, tail low as if sensing his master's distress. Aldrich's eyes moved across the faded ink, each word a dagger to his understanding of everything he'd believed for 30 years. The document bore King Edmund's signature, the same King Aldrich had served faithfully as a royal guard, the same monarch whose death had been attributed to a weak heart. But here, in his own father's hand, was a different truth entirely. "I, Captain Marcus Thorne, do hereby confess to the poisoning of His Majesty King Edmund Valemont on the 14th day of harvest month, in the year of our realm 1247. The words blurred as Aldrich's vision swam. His father, the village blacksmith he'd remembered as gentle and honorable, had been a regicide. But as he read further, the truth became even more complex, more devastating. At the behest of Prince Roderick, rightful heir to the throne of Valdris, in exchange for the lives of my family and the preservation of Millbrook village, the king had discovered Prince Roderick's alliance with the Kashari raiders and intended to name his younger brother, Prince Garrett, as successor. Prince Roderick threatened to burn every village from here to the capital if I refused his demands. Aldrich sank into his father's old chair, the wood groaning under his weight. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets of Millbrook, as if the ghosts of his past were crying out in anguish. Gareth whined softly and placed his massive head on Aldrich's knee. The letter continued, revealing how his father had used his skills as a metal worker to craft a special goblet, one with a false bottom that could release poison into wine when pressed in a certain way. How he'd smuggled it into the castle through Aldrich himself, hidden among other ceremonial pieces the young guard had been asked to deliver for a feast. "I used my own son as an unwitting accomplice," the confession read. "May the gods forgive me, for I cannot forgive myself." Young Aldrich carried the instrument of regicide into the very heart of the kingdom he dreams of serving. The irony burns worse than any forge fire. Aldrich's stomach lurched as memories flooded back. How proud he'd been when his father asked him to deliver those pieces, how it had felt like a blessing on his choice to serve the crown. He remembered Prince Roderick's kind words that night, how the prince had personally thanked him for bringing such beautiful craftsmanship to honor his father, the same man who had ordered that father's murder. King Roderick, who now ruled Valdris with what many called wisdom and strength, was nothing more than a patricidal usurper, and Aldrich, decorated hero of countless battles, sworn protector of the realm, had been the unwitting instrument of his sovereign's assassination. But there was more. His father's confession revealed why Millbrook had been abandoned, why its people had fled in the dead of night 30 years ago. Prince Roderick had honored his bargain to spare the village initially, but as his paranoia grew, he decided loose ends needed cutting. The night Aldrich had been away on his first major campaign, Kashari raiders, secretly in Roderick's employ, had descended on Millbrook. "They came for us all," his father had written. "But word reached us first, and we scattered like leaves before a storm. I stayed behind to leave this confession, hidden where only my son might find it, should he ever return. If you're reading this, Aldrich, know that I loved you more than life itself, and know that the king you serve is the architect of our family's destruction." The letter ended with a map, crude but clear, showing where the survivors of Millbrook had fled. A settlement in the northern mountains, beyond Kashari lands, where they'd tried to rebuild their lives. Aldrich's hands shook as he folded the parchment. Through the window, the first hints of dawn painted the sky a blood red that seemed fitting for such revelations. He had spent 30 years, serving a murderer, believing himself a hero while wearing the colors of the man who had destroyed everything he'd once held dear. Gareth's sudden growl broke through his torment. The hound's ears were pricked forward, focused on something outside. Then Aldrich heard it too, the sound of approaching horses, moving fast despite the early hour. He moved to the window and peered through a crack in the shutters. 6 riders in royal colors were galloping down Millbrook's main street, their leader bearing the silver cloak of the king's special investigators. They'd been found. The ancient stone steps descended into absolute darkness, each footfall echoing with the weight of centuries. Marcus held the torch high, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on walls carved with symbols that predated the kingdom itself. Behind him, Elara's breathing had grown shallow, and he could hear the tremor in each exhale. "These markings," she whispered, running her fingers along the rough-hewn stone. "They're not from our people." Marcus nodded grimly. The deeper they went, the more foreign the architecture became. What had started as crude village stonework had transformed into something far more sophisticated and far older. The air grew thick with the scent of earth and something else, something that made his warrior instincts prickle with unease. At the bottom of the staircase, they emerged into a vast underground chamber. Marcus raised his torch higher, and both of them froze. The walls were lined with shelves carved directly from the living rock, and upon those shelves lay hundreds of scrolls, their ancient parchment somehow preserved in the cool, dry air. "By the gods," Elara breathed. "It's a library." But Marcus was staring at something else entirely. In the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, and upon it lay a single crown. Not the crude iron circlet of their current king, but something magnificent, gold inlaid with precious stones that caught the torchlight and threw it back in brilliant flashes of color. "That's impossible," he muttered, stepping closer despite every instinct telling him to flee. The crown of the first kings was lost 300 years ago. Elara was already at the nearest shelf, carefully extracting a scroll. Her hands shook as she unrolled it, and Marcus watched her face pale in the torchlight. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "you need to see this." He moved to her side, holding the torch so they could both read. The script was archaic, but still legible to anyone with education. What they read made Marcus's blood run cold. The scroll detailed a massacre, the systematic elimination of an entire bloodline, but not by foreign invaders or plague, by the very ancestors of the current royal family. The legitimate heirs to the throne had been hunted down and slaughtered, their bodies hidden, their very existence erased from history. "This can't be real," Marcus said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they rang false. Too many pieces were falling into place. The fear in the villagers' eyes when they spoke of the old days, the way certain names were never mentioned, the gaps in the kingdom's historical records that he'd never questioned. Elara had moved to another scroll, then another. Each document painted the same horrifying picture. The current royal line were usurpers, murderers who had stolen a crown and built their reign on blood and lies. And here, buried beneath a forgotten village, lay the proof that could destroy them. "My father knew," Ilara said suddenly, her voice hollow. "That's why he stayed here. That's why he never left, never spoke of the capital. He was guarding this." Marcus felt the torch waver in his grip. 30 years of loyal service, 30 years of believing in honor, in duty, in the sacred oath he'd sworn to protect the crown. All of it built on a foundation of murder and deception. "There's more," Ilara said, moving deeper into the chamber. She stopped before a section of wall covered in what looked like a family tree carved directly into the stone. Names and dates stretched back centuries, but it was the most recent entries that made Marcus's heart stop. His own name was there, his bloodline traced back through generations to the legitimate royal family, the family that had been massacred, the family whose crown now sat in mocking splendor on the pedestal behind them. "You're the rightful heir," Ilara whispered. "That's why your parents sent you away. That's why they made you take a different name, told everyone you were orphaned. They were protecting you." The torch slipped from Marcus's nerveless fingers, clattering to the stone floor but somehow staying lit. The dancing shadows made the carved names seem to move, seem to beckon. 3 decades of his life suddenly made terrible sense, the unexplained animosity from certain court nobles, the way some of the older servants looked at him with something like recognition, the king's insistence on keeping him close despite Marcus's humble origins. "He knows," Marcus said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "The king knows who I am. He's been watching me, waiting to see if I'd ever discover the truth." Ilara reached for another scroll, but Marcus caught her wrist. "Don't," he said. "We've seen enough." But it was already too late. The knowledge burned in his mind like acid, corroding everything he'd believed about himself, about his duty, about the very kingdom he'd bled to protect. Above them, the village slept peacefully, unaware that the foundations of their world had just crumbled in the darkness below. The loyal guard was dead. What emerged from that chamber would be something else entirely. The ancient stone chamber beneath the village church felt colder than the grave. Sir Marcus Thorne held his torch higher, watching shadows dance across walls that hadn't seen light for 3 decades. His loyal hound Fenris whimpered beside him, the beast's earlier enthusiasm replaced by an almost human dread. "Easy, old friend," Marcus whispered, though his own voice carried a tremor he couldn't quite suppress. The skeletal remains they'd discovered were arranged with deliberate care, not the random scatter of natural death. Each bone had been placed with ceremonial precision, and around the skull a circlet of tarnished silver gleamed in the torchlight. Marcus knew that circlet. He'd seen it in portraits hanging in the castle's great hall, worn by kings whose bloodline supposedly ended with the current dynasty. But here was proof that the royal line hadn't ended at all. Fenris suddenly lifted his massive head, ears pricked toward the chamber's entrance. The sound of footsteps echoed down the stone passage, measured and deliberate. Marcus extinguished his torch, plunging them into absolute darkness, and pressed himself against the cold wall. "Sir Marcus?" The voice belonged to Brother Aldrich, the village priest whose nervous demeanor had troubled Marcus since his return. "I know you're down there. We need to speak." The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the flickering glow of candlelight. Marcus remained silent, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. 30 years of palace intrigue had taught him that desperation made even holy men dangerous. Brother Aldrich appeared in the chamber entrance, his weathered face gaunt in the candlelight. Behind him stood 2 other figures that made Marcus's blood run cold: Commander Garrett, his former captain of the guard, and Lady Vivian, the king's own sister. "You always were too curious for your own good," Commander Garrett said, stepping into the chamber. His hand rested casually on his weapon, though Marcus noticed the tension in the older man's shoulders. "Even as a boy in this village, poking your nose where it didn't belong." Lady Vivian moved gracefully around the skeletal remains, her silk dress incongruous in the dank chamber. "Do you know what you found, Marcus?" Her voice carried the same honeyed tone she'd used in court, but her eyes held a hardness that spoke of terrible secrets. "King Aldwin III, Marcus replied, stepping from the shadows. Fenris growled low, positioning himself between his master and the intruders. "The rightful heir who supposedly died of plague 30 years ago. Except he didn't die of plague, did he?" Brother Aldrich's hands shook as he raised his candle higher. He came here seeking sanctuary. He knew his brother coveted the throne, knew about the plot to poison him. I was just a young priest then, terrified but bound by sacred duty to provide shelter. "And yet, he ended up dead in your crypt," Marcus observed, his eyes never leaving Commander Garrett's sword hand. Lady Vivian laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "My dear Marcus, you speak as if this is some grand conspiracy. Aldwin was dying anyway. The poison had already done its work. We simply ensured his final rest remained peaceful and undisturbed, while his brother claimed the throne built on murder. While the kingdom remained stable," Commander Garrett corrected sharply. "Do you have any idea what civil war would have cost? How many would have died fighting over succession? We preserved the realm." Marcus felt the weight of 3 decades pressing down on him. His entire adult life had been spent serving a usurper, protecting a crown built on fratricide. Every oath he'd sworn, every battle he'd fought, every honor he'd earned, all of it tainted by this fundamental lie. "The people deserved the truth," he said quietly. "The people deserved peace," Lady Vivian countered, "which they've enjoyed for 30 years under my brother's rule. A peace you're now threatening to destroy." Fenris's growling intensified as more figures emerged from the passage behind them. Palace guards in familiar livery, their faces hidden behind ceremonial masks. Marcus realized with growing horror that this confrontation had been planned long before he'd discovered the hidden chamber. "You've been watching me since I returned," he said, understanding flooding through him. "This whole homecoming, my retirement, it was all orchestrated." Brother Aldrich's voice cracked with emotion. "We couldn't let you stumble onto this accidentally. Better to control when and where the discovery happened. And now?" Commander Garrett's expression was genuinely sorrowful. "Now you choose, Marcus. Return to the capital and live out your retirement in comfort, keeping this secret as we have, or—" The unspoken alternative hung heavy in the cold air. Marcus looked down at Fenris, whose intelligent eyes seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. The hound had led him to this truth, and now that truth might destroy them both. The torch flames flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, as Marcus weighed his loyalty against his conscience, his oath against his honor, his life against his principles. The old watchtower loomed against the storm-darkened sky as Marcus pressed his back against the crumbling stone wall, his breath coming in sharp bursts. Thunder rolled overhead, masking the sound of approaching hoofbeats, but he could feel them through the ground, dozens of riders closing in from multiple directions. "They found us faster than I expected," Gareth muttered, checking his crossbow bolts with practiced efficiency. His weathered hands remained steady, despite the chaos erupting around them. Marcus peered around the corner of the tower's base, spotting the first wave of Royal Guardsmen emerging from the tree line. Their polished armor gleamed even in the dim light, and their formation spoke of elite training. His own training turned against him. At their head rode Captain Aldrich, Marcus's former second-in-command, his face a mask of grim determination. "Surrender yourself, Marcus," Aldrich's voice carried across the clearing. "By order of His Majesty, you are commanded to submit to royal justice. Your crimes against the crown cannot go unanswered." Marcus's jaw tightened. Crimes against the crown. The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. The real crime had been committed 30 years ago when the true heir was murdered, when an entire bloodline was erased to secure a usurper's throne. And now they called him traitor for uncovering the truth. "The pendant," he whispered urgently to Gareth. "Did you manage to hide it?" Safe as houses, Gareth replied, patting his coat. But if they take us alive, how long before they torture its location out of us? Before Marcus could answer, a crossbow bolt whistled past his ear, embedding itself in the wooden door behind them. The negotiations were over. Move! Marcus grabbed Gareth's arm, hauling him toward the tower's entrance. The ancient door groaned on rusted hinges as they burst through, immediately starting up the narrow spiral staircase. Their boots echoed off stone walls that had witnessed centuries of conflict, but none quite like this. Behind them, shouts erupted as the guardsmen stormed the base of the tower. Marcus counted at least 8 distinct voices, too many to fight directly, even with his superior skills. They would have to outthink rather than outfight their pursuers. The beacon chamber, Gareth gasped as they climbed. There's a rope system up there, used to signal ships offshore. We might be able to... A crossbow bolt sparked off the stone steps just below Marcus's feet. He spun, drawing his sword in one fluid motion, and deflected 2 more bolts with precise movements that spoke to decades of combat experience. The narrow staircase worked in their favor here. Only one pursuer could engage him at a time. "Keep climbing," he barked to Gareth, then turned to face the first guardsman rounding the curve below. The man's face was hidden behind his helmet's visor, but Marcus recognized the stance, the grip on the sword. Thomas, barely 25, eager to prove himself in service to the crown. Their blades met with a ringing clash that echoed up the tower shaft. Marcus fought defensively, using the cramped quarters to limit Thomas's movements while slowly giving ground up the stairs. He had no desire to kill men he had trained, men who believed they were serving justice. "Your loyalty was always your weakness, Marcus," came a familiar voice from below. Lady Evangeline stepped into view at the base of the tower, her elegant dress seemingly out of place among the armed men. "Even now you hold back against your former students." "And your ambition was always yours, Evangeline," Marcus called back, parrying another strike from Thomas while continuing his tactical retreat. "How long have you known? About the pendant, about what really happened that night?" Her laugh was like winter wind through dead leaves. "I've always known, dear Marcus. Who do you think helped arrange the prince's accident? Some secrets are worth keeping, especially when they secure one's position at court." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow, causing him to stumble slightly. Thomas pressed his advantage, driving forward with renewed aggression, but Marcus recovered in time to deflect the thrust that would have ended their duel. Above them, Gareth had reached the beacon chamber and was working frantically with the rope system. "Marcus, whatever you're planning now would be good." "The people deserve to know the truth," Marcus shouted down at Evangeline while continuing to fence with Thomas. "The rightful heir's blood cries out for justice." "The rightful heir is dead," Evangeline replied coldly. "Has been for 30 years. The only question now is whether you'll join him quietly or whether we'll have to make this unpleasant." More guardsmen were ascending the stairs now, their armor clanking against the narrow walls. Marcus made his decision. With a sudden surge of controlled violence, he disarmed Thomas with a complex wrist movement, sending the young man's sword clattering down the stairs. Then he turned and sprinted upward toward the beacon chamber, where Gareth waited with their only hope of escape. The truth would survive this night, even if they didn't. The ancient stones beneath the royal chapel sang with secrets as Thane pressed his weathered hands against the cold granite. His loyal hound, Ember, whined softly beside him, her amber eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight that danced across the underground chamber they had discovered 3 days prior. The narrow passage behind the altar had been sealed for generations, but Ember's relentless digging in the village cemetery had led them here, to the heart of a conspiracy that made Thane's blood run cold. "Easy, girl," he whispered, though his own voice trembled with the weight of what they had uncovered. The parchments spread before him told a story that contradicted everything he had believed about his kingdom, his king, and his own family's tragic fate. Written in the precise script of court scribes, the documents detailed a systematic purge of village bloodlines, not to protect the realm from rebellion, as he had been told, but to eliminate witnesses to a horrific crime committed by the Crown Prince 30 years ago. Footsteps echoed in the chapel above. Thane quickly gathered the most damning evidence, stuffing the papers inside his leather jerkin as Boots descended the stone steps. His hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword, muscle memory from decades of service overriding the chaos in his mind. "Sir Thane." The voice belonged to Captain Aldrich, the king's most trusted enforcer. "His Majesty requests your immediate presence." Thane's heart hammered against his ribs. Did they know? Had someone seen him and Ember slip into the chapel after midnight prayers? He forced his breathing to steady, drawing upon years of training to mask his turmoil. "Of course, Captain. I was merely paying respects to fallen comrades." The lie came easily, a skill he had mastered during his time at court. Aldrich's steel-grey eyes swept the chamber, lingering on the disturbed dust where the hidden documents had been stored. The king grows impatient. "These late-night wanderings of yours have not gone unnoticed." As they climbed the narrow stairs, Ember padding silently behind them, Thane's mind raced through his options. The evidence tucked against his chest proved that his village hadn't harbored rebels. They had witnessed Crown Prince Marcus assault and murder a young noblewoman during a hunting expedition. The systematic slaughter that followed had been orchestrated to silence an entire community, painted as necessary justice to maintain the kingdom's stability. The great hall loomed before them, torches casting long shadows across the stone walls adorned with tapestries depicting glorious battles and royal triumphs. King Marcus, the same prince whose crimes had cost Thane everything, sat upon his throne, older now but still possessing the cruel intelligence that had allowed him to orchestrate such devastating deception. "My faithful guardian returns," the king said, his voice carrying the same silky tone that had once commanded armies. "Tell me, Thane, what draws you to such dark places at such dark hours?" Thane knelt, his knees striking the cold marble with practiced precision. "Memories, Your Majesty. The weight of years sometimes demands solitary reflection. Indeed, 30 years is a long time to carry guilt, is it not?" The words hit like physical blows. Thane's eyes remained fixed on the floor, but every nerve in his body screamed danger. Beside him, Ember's hackles rose almost imperceptibly. "I have served the crown faithfully, Your Majesty. My guilt extends only to moments when that service fell short of your expectations." King Marcus descended from his throne slowly, deliberately, each step echoing through the vast chamber. "You know, I often wondered if any had escaped that night, if perhaps a young boy might have hidden in the shadows, watching as justice was served upon his treacherous family." Thane's blood turned to ice. The king knew, had always known. "When my scouts found you half dead in the borderlands, speaking of loyalty and honor, I saw an opportunity. What better guardian than one whose life had been forged in the very fires of necessity? What more devoted servant than one who believed he served justice itself?" The papers against Thane's chest felt heavy as millstones. Every commendation, every moment of pride in his service, every life he had taken in the name of crown and kingdom, all built upon a foundation of calculated manipulation. But loyalty built on lies has a way of crumbling, doesn't it? The king stopped mere feet away, just as buried secrets have a way of clawing their way to the surface. Ember's low growl filled the silence that followed. Thane slowly raised his head, meeting the king's gaze for the first time in 3 decades as an equal rather than a subject. In that moment, the decorated royal guard ceased to exist, replaced by the village boy who had lost everything to one man's monstrous appetites. "Yes, Your Majesty," Thane said quietly, his hand moving toward his sword. "They certainly do." The king smiled, but his eyes had already shifted to the crossbow-armed guards emerging from the shadows. The ancient stone chamber beneath the village church felt like a tomb, thick with centuries of dust and secrets. Marcus held the torch higher, its flickering light revealing weathered tapestries that bore the royal seal, but not the current one. These symbols were older, from the time before King Aldric's bloodline claimed the throne. "Look at this," Tobias whispered, his weathered fingers tracing carved letters on a marble sarcophagus. "Prince Garrett of House Kelleran, rightful heir to the throne of Valdris." Marcus felt his blood turn cold. House Kelleran had been wiped out in the Great Purge 35 years ago, or so the history books claimed. Every member of the noble family had supposedly perished in a plague that swept through their lands. But here lay evidence of something far more sinister. "The dates don't match," Marcus said, studying the inscription. "According to this, Prince Garrett died 3 years after the supposed plague. And look at these other tombs." They moved deeper into the chamber, discovering grave after grave of Kelleran family members, their death dates spanning nearly a decade after their alleged extinction. The truth crashed over Marcus like a wave. There had been no plague. King Aldric's father had systematically hunted down and murdered the entire bloodline to secure his claim to the throne. Tobias pulled a leather-bound journal from a niche in the wall. The binding was cracked with age, but the pages within were preserved. "It's a record," he said, squinting at the faded ink. "Written by Father Benedict. He was the village priest during the purge." Marcus took the journal with trembling hands and began to read aloud. "The king's men came again today. They brought young Lady Mira, barely 16, wounded and frightened. She speaks of her family's slaughter, of the lies being spread about disease. I have hidden her with the others in the old cellars beneath the mill, but I fear our sanctuary grows too small." "There were survivors," Tobias breathed. "The villagers were hiding them." Marcus continued reading, his voice growing heavier with each entry. Father Benedict had documented everything: the secret network that smuggled Kelleran survivors to safety, the bribes paid to keep officials silent, and ultimately the tragic discovery of their hiding place. "Listen to this," Marcus said, finding the final entries. "They found us today. The King's Guard captain, Sir Edmund, showed no mercy. He claimed they were rooting out disease, but I saw the truth in his eyes. By royal decree, every soul who bore Kelleran blood or aided their cause was to be eliminated. I pray God forgives us all for what we could not prevent." The pieces fell into place like stones in Marcus's chest. Sir Edmund had been his predecessor, the man whose reputation he'd built his own career upon. The heroic actions that had elevated their village's guard captain to legend were actually the systematic genocide of an entire noble house. "That's why the village was forgotten," Tobias said quietly. "The king couldn't let anyone remember what happened here. He let it fade from maps and memory rather than risk the truth emerging." Marcus sank onto a stone bench, the weight of revelation crushing him. "I've spent 30 years serving a crown built on mass murder. I've sworn oaths to a king whose grandfather was a usurper and a butcher." "What do we do with this?" Tobias asked, gesturing to the evidence surrounding them. Before Marcus could answer, the sound of footsteps echoed from above. Both men froze, listening to the measured tread of multiple boots crossing the church floor overhead. Marcus extinguished the torch immediately, plunging them into absolute darkness. "Stay quiet," he whispered, drawing his sword by instinct despite the futility of fighting in pitch black. A voice called down from above, refined, educated, and chillingly familiar. "Sir Marcus of the Royal Guard, I know you're down there. You've discovered our family's tomb, haven't you?" Marcus's blood turned to ice. The voice belonged to Lord Chancellor Voss, King Aldric's most trusted advisor. "Surprised to hear from me?" Voss continued. "You shouldn't be. Did you truly think such a significant discovery would go unnoticed? We've been watching this village for decades, waiting for someone to stumble upon the truth." Tobias gripped Marcus's arm in the darkness. The implications were staggering. The current regime not only knew about the massacre, but had been actively protecting the secret. "Come up, Sir Marcus," Voss called. "Bring whatever evidence you've found. It's time we discussed your future, and more importantly, your silence." Marcus heard more footsteps above, the deliberate positioning of armed men around the church. They were trapped, surrounded by representatives of the very crown he'd served faithfully for 3 decades. In the suffocating darkness of the tomb, surrounded by the bones of the rightful royal family, Marcus faced an impossible choice: emerge and likely face execution for his discovery, or remain hidden and let the truth die with them in this forgotten chamber. The kingdom's fate, and his own, hung in the balance of his next decision. The dawn mist clung to the cobblestones as Marcus stood before the palace gates one final time. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the leather satchel containing the documents that would either vindicate his choice or seal his fate. Behind him, the village he'd once called home lay in ruins, its secrets finally exposed to the harsh light of truth. The guards at the gate recognized him immediately, despite the grime and exhaustion etched into his features. They stepped aside with practiced deference, though Marcus caught the whispered conversations that followed in his wake. Word traveled fast within these walls, and the events of the past weeks had undoubtedly reached even the lowest servants' ears. His boots echoed against the marble floors as he made his way through corridors that had once felt like home. Portraits of long-dead monarchs gazed down at him with painted eyes that seemed to judge his every step. How many of them had known? How many had willingly participated in the conspiracy that had festered like an infected wound in the kingdom's heart? The throne room doors loomed ahead, flanked by guards whose loyalty Marcus could no longer assume. Captain Aldrich emerged from the shadows, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. "Marcus," Aldrich said quietly, "you don't have to do this. There are other ways." "Are there?" Marcus replied, his voice hoarse from the smoke and shouting of recent days. 30 years, Aldrich? 30 years I've served a lie?" The captain's hand moved instinctively toward his sword hilt, then stopped. "The kingdom will survive this revelation, but will you?" Marcus met his old friend's gaze steadily. "That's no longer my concern." The throne room stretched before him like a cathedral of power, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows. King Aldwin sat upon the throne of ages, but the man Marcus had sworn to protect with his life now looked diminished, almost fragile in the morning light streaming through stained-glass windows. "My lord," Marcus said, dropping to one knee but keeping his eyes fixed on the king's face. "Rise, Sir Marcus. After what you've discovered, such formalities seem rather pointless." The king's voice carried the weight of resignation. "I assume you've come to fulfill your duty one last time." Marcus stood slowly, his joints protesting after days of pursuit and conflict. "The people deserve the truth about what happened in Millbrook, about what your father ordered, about what you've spent 30 years covering up." King Aldwin descended from his throne with measured steps, each footfall echoing in the vast chamber. "And what truth is that, old friend? That monarchs sometimes make terrible choices for what they believe to be the greater good? That power corrupts even the most well-intentioned hearts? The truth that you ordered those families killed to hide your father's illegitimate claim to the throne? That my own brother died trying to protect evidence that would have exposed the usurpation?" Marcus's voice cracked on the final word, 3 decades of suppressed grief finally breaking free. The king stopped mere feet away, and for a moment Marcus saw not the crown but the frightened young prince who had inherited an impossible situation. "Your brother was a good man, Marcus. His death haunts me still. But consider the alternative. Civil war, thousands dead, a kingdom torn apart. Was the price worth avoiding that catastrophe?" "That wasn't your choice to make alone," Marcus replied, pulling the satchel from his shoulder. "These documents prove everything. The forged genealogies, the bribes, the murders. The people have a right to know what was done in their name." Guards shifted nervously at the edges of the room, uncertain whether they were witnessing treason or justice. The distinction, Marcus realized, might be nothing more than a matter of perspective. King Aldwin stared at the satchel as if it were a coiled serpent. "And after you reveal this truth, what then? Chaos? Revolution? The blood of innocents on your hands instead of mine?" Marcus felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him like a physical force. His faithful companion, loyal to the end, had died bringing these secrets to light. Thomas had believed the truth was worth any price, but standing here in the seat of power, Marcus finally understood the true cost of revelation. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but that's a burden I'm prepared to bear. Some sins are too great to remain hidden, regardless of the consequences." The king nodded slowly, a sad smile crossing his weathered features. "Then do what you must, Sir Marcus. History will judge us both." Marcus reached into the satchel and withdrew the damning evidence, documents that would reshape everything they'd built. As he prepared to speak the words that would topple a kingdom, he thought of his brother, of Thomas, of all the innocent souls who had died for these secrets. The truth, he had learned, was never truly buried. It always found a way to surface, no matter how deep or how long ago it had been interred. And sometimes, the living owed the dead nothing less than the courage to let it breathe.